Everyone told you healing was a process. Nobody told you the process was designed for a different kind of wound. You did the work. You know you did. The journaling, the therapy, the no contact, the morning routine you built like a fortress around yourself, the books, the podcasts, the breathing exercises at 2 a.m. when your nervous system forgot what quiet felt like. You followed every instruction. You checked every box. And they are still there. Not in your life. In your head. In the part of your head that runs without your permission. The part that replays the last conversation, the last text, the last time you saw their face and already knew something was ending. Here is what nobody in the healing industry will say out loud. Some wounds do not heal. They stabilize. And there is a significant clinical difference between those two things. The healing industry, and it is an industry with a revenue model and a retention strategy, was built around a specific assumption that what happened to you was an event. Something with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Something your brain could process, integrate, and file. But, therefore, your brain was built to process events. But what happened to you was not an event. Therefore, your brain has been trying to file something that has no edges. Chronic relational trauma, which is the clinical term for what happens when the damage was not one moment but a pattern, a slow erosion across months or years, does not respond to the tools built for acute grief. Journaling is a grief tool. Therapy timelines are built around grief. The no contact rule was designed for clean breaks. You did not have a clean break. You had a slow dismantling. That is why the tools did not work the way they were supposed to, not because you used them wrong, because you were applying a bandage to something that needed reconstruction. Have you ever noticed that the healing content always works on you for about 3 days? You feel clarity, distance, something almost like peace, and then it collapses. You assumed that was failure. It was not failure. It was your nervous system accurately reporting that nothing had actually changed underneath the clarity. Your body is not confused. Your body is extremely precise. Here is the mechanism most people never get told. When a relationship causes sustained neurological disruption, repeated cycles of threat and relief, unpredictability, emotional dysregulation that became your baseline, your brain does not store that as memory. It stores it as operating system. The person does not live in your memories. They live in your threat detection architecture, which is a clinical way of saying they became part of how your brain decides what is safe. This is why you can go 6 weeks without thinking about them clearly and then hear a song or smell something or see a car the same color as theirs, and the entire system comes back online in under 3 seconds. That is not weakness. That is not a failure of your healing journey. That is your amygdala doing exactly what it was trained to do. You trained it. They handed you the training materials. Stay with me here. I know this sounds like it is moving away from you. It is about to move directly toward you. The self-help industry has a term for the progress you have made. They call it growth. They put it on a graph that goes up and to the right. Clean, measurable, optimistic. Your actual recovery looks nothing like that graph. It looks like a flat line with occasional electrical interference, which, coincidentally, is exactly what survival looks like on a monitor. You know what the healing industry calls that? A setback, a regression. Evidence that you need more journaling, more therapy, more content about letting go. You know what a neurologist calls it? Normal, expected. Physiologically accurate for the level of disruption you experienced. Actually, no, let me come at this differently. The problem is not that you cannot heal. The problem is that you were handed a definition of healing that was never going to fit what happened to you, and you accepted it, and then you spent months measuring yourself against a standard built for people who had arguments, not architecture damage. Grief has a timeline because grief has an object. You lost a person. That is real. But what you also lost, and this is the part nobody builds a recovery plan around, is the version of yourself that existed before they changed how your nervous system runs. That version is not coming back. Not because you are broken, because you are different now. Because exposure to sustained unpredictability at a neurological level does not leave you unchanged. It leaves you recalibrated. Recalibration is not healing. It is more expensive than healing. It takes longer. It does not have a podcast episode. It does not have a 30-day plan. What it has is time and repetition and the slow accumulation of evidence that the threat is gone, collected by a nervous system that still is not entirely sure. Most people in week 9 of their healing journey are not healing. They are teaching their amygdala, one data point at a time, that the thing it learned to fear is no longer in the room. The self-help industry charges by the month for this information. Here we just call it what it is. Survival with good posture. Here is what surviving them actually looks like. And I want you to pay attention to this because most people have been doing this correctly and calling it failure. You stopped reaching out, not because you healed, because you made a decision your nervous system was not fully behind yet, and you held it anyway. That is not recovered. That is disciplined survival. You built a routine. Not because mornings feel good now, because structure is the only environment where a dysregulated nervous system can begin to predict what comes next. You were not healing yourself. You were building a controlled environment for something that needed predictability to stabilize. You stopped talking about them constantly. Not because they are gone from your internal landscape. Because at some point you looked at the people around you and recognized that explaining this particular damage to someone who had not experienced it was functionally impossible. They are still there. You just stopped narrating them. That is not silence, that is economy. There is something the healing industry will never tell you, because it would collapse the business model entirely. Some people do not need more healing content. They need permission to stop calling what they are doing broken. You are not behind. You are not failing the process. You are surviving something the process was not designed for. With consistency, with discipline, with a nervous system that has been through actual disruption and is still, daily, choosing to stay functional. That is not a small thing. That is not something you put on a healing timeline and measure against week 3 of someone else's breakup. If you have been waiting for someone to tell you that what you are doing counts, it counts. Not because it feels like healing, because it is harder than healing. Because you are doing it without the chemicals that make early grief feel meaningful, without the momentum of acute pain, in the long middle stretch where nobody asks how you are anymore because enough time has passed that they assume you are fine. You are not fine. You are functional. There is a difference, and the difference is significant, and almost nobody will acknowledge it. The deeper problem was never that you could not heal. The deeper problem was that you were handed a map for a territory you were never actually in, and you spent months wondering why you kept getting lost. You're not lost. You're in different terrain than the map described. And you have been navigating it correctly without knowing it had a name. The verdict. What you have been doing is not failure dressed up as effort. It is survival dressed up as nothing. Because nobody gave it a name, and unnamed things look like nothing even when they are everything. The next video is about why they left. Not the story they told you, not the story you told yourself. The actual mechanism, what they were responding to when they walked away, and why it says something very different about you than you were led to believe. If this frequency reached you, stay tuned in.